Hello everyone, welcome to Eerora. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The town library stood at the edge of the square, its stone facade softened by ivy and years of rain. Inside, the floors carried the scent of wax and paper, and every evening at 9, the head librarian, Margaret Hill, would lock the oak doors, walk down the narrow side street, and vanish into the quiet rhythm of her life. For 22 years, this ritual was unbroken. Yet, on a Tuesday in late autumn, the doors were locked, the lights extinguished, and Margaret herself was nowhere to be found. The first signs of something amiss came not from alarm, but from silence. Wednesday morning, the staff arrived to find the library sealed exactly as Margaret would have left it. Doors locked, alarms armed, blinds drawn, but she had not returned home. Her small brick cottage sat untouched, the morning paper still at the doorstep. The kettle, often left out for tea, was empty and dry. Even her car, a modest sedan, remained parked behind the library. It was as if Margaret had walked into the shadows between closing time and dawn and never returned. Investigators began with the timeline. The last visitor remembered leaving around 8:45 p.m., and Margaret was seen shelving books shortly after. By 9:05, the exterior doors were bolted and the motion sensors armed. No alarms were triggered overnight, suggesting that if she disappeared inside, it was by her own movement. Yet there was no sign of disturbance. No forced entry, no missing items, no disorder. The only peculiarity was a single desk lamp left glowing in the archives, a section Margaret seldom used that late. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, private, and bound by routine. She was not one to take sudden trips, nor one to vanish without notice. The local police searched the library, room by room, their footsteps echoing in the reading halls, their flashlights sweeping over rows of spines. In the archives, where the lamp had been left burning, they found her reading glasses neatly folded beside a ledger of checkouts. No fingerprints beyond her own, no signs of struggle. A chair slightly askew, as if she had risen quickly. Attention then turned outward. Security cameras on the square captured her usual closing routine. Drawing blinds, locking the main doors, then stepping briefly into the alley behind the building. She carried a small leather satchel, as always. At 9:12 p.m., her figure slips into shadow near the side entrance. She does not reappear. For the next 7 hours, the alley remains empty except for drifting leaves and the occasional headlights of passing cars. Neighbors near the alley heard nothing unusual. A dog barked around midnight, but that was a common sound in the narrow streets. The only faint anomaly was a report of footsteps, measured unhurried around 9:30. Too soft to alarm, too brief to trace. One neighbor recalled hearing what she described as a faint ring, like a telephone, though no phones were stationed outside. That detail would later linger uneasily in the reports, unexplainable and unresolved. Her cottage was examined with equal care. Doors locked from within, windows latched, no sign of hurried departure. A cup of chamomile tea leaves rested dry at the bottom of her mug, as though she had not yet returned to brew the nightly drink she favored. Drawers and closets remained orderly. Nothing missing but the satchel she always carried, containing her keys, her wallet, and a worn notebook she used for reference notes. What unsettled investigators most was the absence of digital trace. Margaret's mobile phone, an older model seldom used for more than brief calls, sent its last signal at 9:11 p.m., pinging off a tower near the library. After that, silence. No texts, no calls, no data. Bank accounts remained untouched. No travel bookings, no online orders. For a woman who lived quietly but predictably, this sudden erasure felt deliberate or orchestrated. Her colleagues recalled small fragments in the days before. A note she made about unusual visitors in the archives, mentioned once in passing but never explained. A colleague remembered her checking out older newspapers, particularly crime columns from decades past. Another noticed she had begun locking her office door during lunch breaks, something she had not done before. None of these details, alone, suggested danger, but together they painted a picture of someone perhaps unsettled. As days passed, theories multiplied. Some suspected an abduction, though with no evidence of force, it seemed unlikely. Others whispered about voluntary disappearance, but her cottage and habits contradicted this. Her family, distant cousins in another state, insisted she was devoted to her work and her quiet life. Still, the image persisted. Margaret locking the doors with practiced care, stepping into the night, then dissolving into silence. Search teams combed the nearby riverbank, the wooded trails on the edge of town, even abandoned structures once used by the railway. Dogs traced faint scents near the alley, but they ended abruptly at the curb, as though she had entered a vehicle. Yet no cameras showed such a car. No witness heard an engine. No trace of tires appeared on the damp ground. 1 week later, her satchel was discovered, not in the town, but 5 miles away, propped against the gate of an unused farm. Inside were her glasses, wallet, and notebook. The wallet still held cash and cards. The notebook contained pages of meticulous notes on cataloging, as well as a final entry dated the evening of her disappearance. The words were simple: archives, folder missing, check again. No folder was ever identified. The satchel deepened the mystery. How had it traveled 5 miles with no sign of Margaret? The gate where it rested faced a road seldom used, the gravel coated in a thin layer of moss that bore no footprints. The farm had been uninhabited for years, windows boarded, barns leaning with age. Yet the satchel was upright, clean, untouched by rain, as if carefully placed. The investigation would continue for months, weaving through leads that withered into silence. But in that first week, the image of the satchel by the farm gate haunted the town. People began locking their doors earlier, drawing blinds tighter, and each evening at 9, when the library should have closed under Margaret's careful watch, the silence seemed deeper. It was not the absence of answers that unsettled most, but the precision of her disappearance. A life folded neatly away, a lamp left glowing, a satchel placed like a marker in a field no one visited. And so the question remains: what drew Margaret Hill into the shadows of that autumn night, and what presence, unseen by cameras and unheard by neighbors, walked with her into the silence? When investigators returned to the satchel at the farm gate, their questions multiplied faster than answers could be gathered. Why leave her belongings intact if theft had been the motive? Why carry them miles from the town, only to set them carefully against rusted bars that had not swung open in over a decade? The discovery shifted the investigation from a simple missing person case to something layered and deliberate. The notebook inside the satchel became a focal point. Each page was filled in Margaret's precise hand, her notes spanning titles, catalog numbers, cross-references between editions. It was the last line, however, archives, folder missing, check again, that pulled attention back to the library itself. Detectives returned to the archives, determined to search shelf by shelf. The archives were a hushed wing, heavy with dust and the scent of aging paper. Rows of bound volumes lined the shelves, each bearing decades-old reports and newspapers, preserved under thin protective sleeves. They checked for empty gaps, misfiled items, signs of disturbance. And on the third row from the back, they found one section shifted slightly out of order. A collection of local crime reports from the late 1970s. Within it, a single folder was missing entirely. The staff could not explain it. Borrowers had no access to these files. Only staff could remove them, and all removals required sign out in a ledger. No record existed. Margaret's last note, written hours before her disappearance, suggested she had noticed the absence. Investigators began to wonder, had she stumbled upon something in the records that someone wished to keep hidden? Attention turned to the contents of the missing folder. Old library staff recalled it might have contained microfiche of newspaper reports about a series of unsolved burglaries that escalated into violence. One incident involved the assault of a clerk in a nearby town. Another, the disappearance of a drifter who was last seen near the same square where the library now stood. These cases had faded into obscurity, unresolved and mostly forgotten. But if Margaret had uncovered irregularities, or perhaps connections others missed, it could explain why she wrote her final note. Investigators widened their scope. They began to reconstruct her final week. Witnesses remembered her walking home with a stack of photocopied pages tucked under her arm, which she never left in plain sight. A student recalled overhearing her mention, records that don't add up. Another librarian noticed she stayed late in the archives 3 nights running, something she rarely did. These fragments painted a picture of a woman absorbed in research, possibly on the edge of discovery. But what exactly did she discover? Detectives tracked down the drifter's surviving relatives. Few remained, but one sister recalled being contacted years ago by someone claiming to have information, only for the caller never to follow up. The description of the caller's voice was vague, but what struck her was the timing. It had been autumn, the anniversary of the disappearance. Margaret's sudden fixation on those old files, also in autumn, now seemed more than coincidence. Back in town, police canvassed the streets again, asking shopkeepers and residents if they had seen Margaret that night beyond the alley. A shop owner swore he saw a figure matching her description, stepping into a dark sedan around 9:15 p.m. But the camera on the square captured no such vehicle. Could the car have parked just beyond the frame, waiting in silence? Or had the witness mistaken another passerby in the dim light? The detail remained uncertain. Then came a peculiar development. At the edge of the farm where the satchel was found, surveyors noted faint impressions on the ground, parallel tracks, shallow but distinct, as if a vehicle had stopped briefly and turned back. The soil was soft from recent rain, yet the marks led only a short distance before blending into the gravel road. No tire pattern could be matched. Still, the presence of tracks near the satchel's location revived suspicion of a vehicle's role in her disappearance. The digital trail, scant as it was, offered a faint anomaly. Her phone's last ping at 9:11 p.m. aligned with her locking the library, but technicians discovered a secondary log. At 9:28, a call was attempted from her phone. It never connected. No number appeared in the records, as though the digits were incomplete. This raised troubling possibilities. Had someone else tried to use her phone? Or had Margaret herself attempted a call before losing signal? Either way, the detail underscored a chilling reality. The phone had been active later than assumed, yet it was never found with her satchel. Investigators turned to the town's past. They uncovered that the unused farm where the satchel was placed once belonged to a family implicated in the very burglaries from the missing archive folder. Though never convicted, two brothers were questioned extensively in the 1970s before charges collapsed. Both men had since passed away, but distant relatives still lived nearby. Could Margaret's interest in the records have stirred old shadows, pressing on secrets some wanted buried? As weeks stretched on, the town grew restless. Rumors spread of hidden tunnels under the library, of secret rooms in the archives, of Margaret having uncovered a list of names tied to unsolved crimes. None of these claims were substantiated, but each whispered tale added unease. Patrons began to request books nervously, casting glances at the archives as though they might hold answers or dangers. Detectives remained grounded in evidence. They combed the satchel again, testing for prints. None beyond Margaret's. They examined the notebook under ultraviolet light. No hidden writing appeared. Yet, in the margins of the last page, faint impressions hinted that she had written notes on a sheet now missing, perhaps torn away. The impressions were incomplete, but one fragment of a word emerged. Farm. Whether this referred to the gate where her satchel was found, or another site entirely, remained unresolved. The investigation pressed deeper into her final hours. One officer reconstructed the timeline down to the minute. Margaret locked the library at 9:05. Her phone pinged at 9:11. The possible sighting of a sedan occurred around 9:15. The phone's unconnected call registered at 9:28, and by morning, she was gone. The gaps between those times became haunting. What transpired in those 17 minutes after she vanished from camera? Where was she during the call attempt? And why did her satchel surface so deliberately placed, miles away, days later? The case file grew thicker with each unanswered question. To the public, it became the story of the librarian who had walked into the shadows. To investigators, it became a puzzle with pieces missing, as though someone had not only taken Margaret, but also pruned the evidence with care. And so the investigation reached a point of chilling tension. They had traces of old crimes resurfacing, a vanished folder, a satchel placed as a message, and a timeline riddled with gaps. Yet the central question remained untouched. Was Margaret silenced because of what she discovered, or because of what she was about to reveal? The third month of Margaret Hill's disappearance brought a shift in the investigation. The police had combed through evidence so often that the pages of the case file grew soft at the corners, but every rereading only deepened the sense that the librarian's vanishing was not a crime of chance. Something about it bore the weight of design, as though her movements that night were anticipated and interrupted. Detectives revisited the archives yet again, focusing on the missing folder from the 1970s. A retired officer from that era was contacted. His memory was faint, yet when he heard the folder was missing, his voice slowed. He recalled those burglaries vividly, especially one detail buried in the reports. The brothers suspected at the time were thought to have stashed evidence of their crimes somewhere beyond town, possibly on the very farmland where Margaret's satchel would later be found. The cases fell apart before a trial, but rumors of hidden documents persisted for years. Now, the missing folder seemed less like a coincidence and more like a clue deliberately erased. Search teams were sent to the abandoned farmstead. The barns were collapsing, their beams brittle from decades of damp. In the main house, dust coated every surface, yet a single floorboard near the back room was looser than the rest. Beneath it, they found a cavity, empty save for scraps of newspaper clippings, long degraded by time. The clippings mentioned burglaries, missing persons, and court hearings. None were complete, but each bore faint handwritten marks in the margins. No fingerprints could be recovered, but the discovery was unsettling. Had Margaret been close to locating such a place? Had someone reached it before her, removing what remained? Attention shifted back to her satchel and its placement by the farm gate. The decision to set it upright, undisturbed, suggested intention. To investigators, it felt like a message, proof that she had been there, yet withheld from them was the outcome. Some theorized it was meant as a warning, a gesture that someone controlled what traces of Margaret could and could not be found. Despite widening their net, detectives found no financial motive. Her accounts remained untouched, her life insurance unclaimed, her belongings intact. If not robbery, then what? Theories tilted toward silencing. Silencing a woman who might have been piecing together a forgotten chapter of the town's past. Margaret's notes, her final line about a missing folder, and her repeated late nights in the archives all pointed toward research that unsettled someone. The investigation gradually quieted, as such cases often do. Leads dwindled. Witnesses repeated themselves. Months turned into a year, and Margaret's cottage fell into disuse. The library appointed a new head, but the archives never felt the same. Staff avoided the aisle where the missing folder had been, and patrons found themselves whispering as though the silence demanded respect. The official file remained open but stagnant. In the absence of answers, the town shaped its own narrative. Some believed Margaret had uncovered corruption, tying officials to crimes long buried. Others whispered that she had been taken not by people, but by the very shadows she had studied. The vanished drifter, the unsolved burglaries, folded back into the same darkness that erased them. Yet small details kept curiosity alive. The unfinished phone call at 9:28 p.m. remained unexplained. The satchel's placement remained deliberate, and the faint impression of the word farm in her notebook margins suggested her final thoughts pointed toward the very ground where evidence had once been hidden. No resolution came. No body was ever recovered. No conclusive evidence tied her disappearance to any suspect. The unanswered questions lingered like dust in the library air, settling on every shelf she once tended. Each year, on the anniversary of her vanishing, townsfolk reported a peculiar thing. The old lamp in the archives, though checked and unplugged, flickered faintly at dusk. Staff insisted it was faulty wiring, but others believed it was Margaret's reminder that the last light she left behind was still waiting to be seen. Her absence remains. The librarian who locked the doors did not return, and the archives still carry a hollow space where a folder once rested. What she discovered, or nearly discovered, was never revealed. And so the case endures, not with an answer, but with the quiet weight of a mystery still sealed in the walls of her library. The mountain lake sat in silence, a mirror of still water edged by pines. In summer, it welcomed families and fishermen, but in early spring, the campground was mostly empty, a place where cold winds lingered and only the most determined stayed overnight. On a Sunday evening, rangers found a campsite on the far edge of the lake. A small fire had burned down to embers. A pair of boots sat neatly beside it, soles pointing toward the warmth. The tent was zipped shut, yet the camper who had pitched it was gone. The discovery came by chance. Rangers were conducting a routine patrol of the lakeside trail, checking for damage after recent storms. The campsite appeared orderly at first, gear stowed, cooking supplies stacked, fire contained. But no one answered when they called out. Inside the tent lay a sleeping bag unrolled, a lantern switched off, and a journal open to half-written notes. The handwriting trailed mid-sentence, as if interrupted. Identification was straightforward. The tent belonged to Daniel Rowe, a 34-year-old teacher from a nearby town who had driven up alone for a weekend of solitude. His car was parked in the gravel lot by the trailhead, keys still inside a side pocket of his backpack. Rangers contacted his family, who said Daniel often camped alone, but always returned promptly for work. By Monday morning, he had missed a scheduled class, raising immediate concern. The initial search focused on the lake itself. Divers entered the cold water, their beams slicing through murky depths. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints in the silt, no sign of disturbance along the shoreline. The boots left beside the fire seemed to contradict the drowning theory. If Daniel had entered the water, why remove them so carefully, placing them in line with the fire as though expecting to return? The journal deepened the unease. Its last entry, dated the evening before, described the quiet of the forest, the call of an owl, and the comfort of a steady fire. The final line read simply, "Heard steps on the trail after dark. Thought I was alone out here." No further words followed. Investigators widened the search to the forest trails. Dogs were brought in, noses pressed to Daniel's clothing for scent. The animals traced a path from the fire ring toward the northern ridge, then abruptly lost the trail at a bend marked by rocks. The soil there was thin, covered in pine needles, which could have concealed tracks. The absence of clear prints added to the mystery. Rangers interviewed the few campers who had stayed that weekend. One pair, fishing on the opposite bank, recalled seeing a figure walking the ridge trail around dusk. The figure appeared alone, carrying a lantern, though the distance made details uncertain. Another group reported hearing two voices echo faintly after dark, though they could not discern words. In the stillness of the forest, sound traveled strangely, making it hard to place the source. Daniel's belongings offered no answers. His phone, found in the tent pocket, contained photos of the lake taken hours earlier, peaceful, ordinary images. The last timestamp was 6:47 p.m., a picture of the fire ring just as twilight fell. No calls or texts followed. His wallet contained cash and cards, untouched. The journal remained the most troubling artifact. Its unfinished sentence, whispering of company where none should have been. The investigation began to take on the shape of a puzzle built from absence. Boots by the fire, a sentence unfinished, steps unheard by anyone but him. Theories emerged. Some speculated he followed someone into the woods, drawn by curiosity or concern. Others wondered if he had staged his disappearance, though his orderly camp and lack of preparation for a longer absence made that unlikely. Days passed, and the search intensified. Helicopters scanned the ridges, their lights sweeping through trees. Volunteers combed underbrush, calling his name until their voices faded into the wind. Yet no trace emerged. It was as though Daniel Rowe had stepped away from his fire and been absorbed by the forest itself. What struck investigators most was the deliberate stillness of his campsite. Nothing suggested panic or haste. The boots were lined with care. The fire burned down naturally. The journal lay open, pen beside it, waiting for a hand that never returned. The details combined into a picture that felt less like accident and more like interruption. In the small town Daniel had called home, news spread quickly. Students spoke of his calm manner, his love of literature, his habit of urging them to notice the details others passed by. Friends described him as cautious, never reckless, someone who prepared carefully for every trip. The thought of him wandering unprepared into the dark woods did not fit. And so the question formed, quiet but insistent. If Daniel Rowe did not vanish by chance, then who walked the trail that night, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps and a pair of boots by the fire? The search for Daniel Rowe extended beyond the ridges of the lake. As days turned into a week, investigators began to shift their focus from immediate rescue to careful reconstruction of his final known hours. The tent and campfire were studied again, this time with forensic precision. Soil samples were taken from beneath the boots, revealing nothing unusual. No mud, no foreign fibers, no trace of hurried removal. They seemed to have been set down as one would place shoes by a hearth at home, a gesture of order and comfort. The journal was examined for impressions left by earlier notes. Under ultraviolet light, faint marks from a previous page emerged. A phrase, half legible, reading, "North Path." The word suggested Daniel had considered or planned to explore the northern trail, the same path where the dogs had lost his scent. Investigators now wondered if his final walk was intentional, drawn by curiosity or by the sound of those phantom footsteps he had noted. Interviews resumed with a handful of campers present that weekend. The fishermen on the opposite bank were pressed for detail. They recalled the figure they saw carried a lantern, its glow moving steadily along the ridge trail. They estimated the time as just after sunset, between 7:15 and 7:30. When shown photographs, they could not confirm it was Daniel. The distance had blurred certainty. Another camper, a woman hiking alone, reported hearing what she described as 2 sets of steps near the northern path around nightfall. She had dismissed it then, assuming other hikers, but in retrospect, it unsettled her. Investigators pieced these accounts into a timeline. Daniel's last photo was at 6:47 p.m., the journal entry likely written shortly after. By 7:15, someone with a lantern was seen on the ridge. By nightfall, voices or steps were heard. Some time after, silence. It was not conclusive, but it suggested Daniel may have left his camp willingly, perhaps to follow or meet someone. Attention turned to the possibility of other visitors. Rangers checked entry logs for vehicles parked at the trailhead. 4 were accounted for, 2 belonging to the fisherman, 1 to the solo hiker, and Daniel's own car. A 5th set of tire impressions was noted in the gravel, faint but distinct, without a corresponding entry. The impressions led away from the lot toward a service road seldom used. No license plate was recorded. The unexplained vehicle became a troubling thread. Investigators then searched Daniel's background for clues. His family confirmed he had no debts, no enemies, no conflicts that might have prompted foul play. His students remembered him as steady and patient, someone who found peace in the outdoors. Yet one colleague recalled him mentioning, just days before his trip, that he wanted quiet to think through something. When asked to clarify, the colleague admitted she had assumed it was work stress, but now wondered if it had been something deeper. The journal contained no mention of conflict or unusual encounters prior to the final entry. Its earlier pages were filled with serene observations, reflections on water, descriptions of birdsong, notes on passages of poetry he had brought to read. The abrupt shift in tone, heard steps on the trail after dark, thought I was alone out here, stood in stark contrast to everything else. It felt like an intrusion, written into his solitude. Search dogs were redeployed to the northern ridge. This time, they were led beyond the bend where the trail had gone cold. After hours of patient work, one dog alerted faintly near a cluster of rocks overlooking the lake. No clear evidence was found, no clothing, no blood, no belongings. But in a crack between stones, investigators found the stub of a burnt match. It was impossible to date, but its presence suggested someone had paused there. The fishermen confirmed that the lantern they saw had briefly paused in that area before vanishing from sight. Forensic experts examined the match, but without fingerprints or residue, it offered no breakthrough. Yet symbolically, it suggested that someone may have stood watching the lake that night, striking a flame in silence. Attention shifted to the unexplained vehicle. Rangers canvassed nearby towns, asking whether anyone had driven into the area late that Sunday. A clerk at a gas station on the highway recalled selling fuel to a man driving an older, dark-colored sedan around dusk. The man had asked casually if the road to the lake was open, but provided no name. The description was vague. Average build, wearing a cap, but it placed another potential figure heading toward the campground that night. Speculation grew. Some believed Daniel may have encountered this driver, willingly or otherwise. Others considered the possibility that the stranger had been present in the woods before Daniel even arrived, waiting unseen until nightfall. Investigators also examined Daniel's car. No signs of tampering were found. However, tucked in the glove compartment was a folded trail map. A faint pencil mark circled the northern ridge path, the same direction his scent had led. No one knew when he had drawn it, but its presence aligned with the impressions in his journal. He seemed drawn northward for reasons he never had time to explain. False leads emerged and dissolved. One hiker reported seeing a figure resembling Daniel at a roadside diner miles away 2 days later, but cameras disproved it. Another claimed to hear a man's voice calling in the woods, but search teams found only echoes carried by wind. Each rumor brought hope, then disappointment. Weeks stretched into months. The lake thawed into summer. Fishermen returned, hikers filled trails. But the campsite where the boots were found remained marked and sealed. People spoke quietly of the teacher who had left his fire and never returned. His absence became part of the landscape, woven into the forest as surely as the owl calls he once wrote about. For investigators, one truth grew harder to ignore. The deliberate care of the campsite suggested he expected to come back. The unfinished journal line, the boots set neatly, the fire left to burn down naturally. None fit the pattern of a man planning to vanish. Something intervened in that space between his steps on the northern path and the silence that followed. And so the case reached a stage where every clue pointed outward but never closed inward. A lantern moving on the ridge, footsteps where none should be, a vehicle unaccounted for, a match stub hidden between rocks. Each detail suggested presence, yet Daniel Rowe remained absent, leaving investigators and his community with a lingering question. Who shared the woods with him that night? And why did only one man fail to return from the silence? By midsummer, the investigation into Daniel Rowe's disappearance had shifted from active search to quiet review. The trails had been walked countless times, the lake dragged and scanned, the ridge examined rock by rock. No further trace of him emerged. What remained were fragments: a campsite intact, boots aligned, a journal entry unfinished, and a lantern seen in the dusk by others. The question investigators asked most often was not where he had gone, but what drew him away from his fire in the first place. His family insisted he was careful, never reckless, the kind of man who measured every step. For him to leave without shoes, in the cold, at night, meant the reason must have felt urgent, or reassuring enough that he believed he would return quickly. They studied the journal again. The words, "Heard steps on the trail after dark. Thought I was alone out here," carried weight. It was the only line in which he acknowledged another presence. Did he step out to confront a stranger? Did he follow the sound to assure himself no danger lurked? Or did someone arrive at his camp and draw him away, promising something that convinced him to leave the warmth of the fire and his boots behind? Rangers revisited the ridge at dusk, walking slowly in silence, listening. The trail narrowed there, sound carrying across the water. Footsteps could echo strangely, creating illusions of nearness. Standing at the bend where dogs had lost the scent, investigators realized a person could vanish from view with only a few passes into the tree line. Lantern light, briefly visible, could fade in an instant. The geography itself seemed to conspire with disappearance. Months later, a hiker stumbled upon a curious sight 2 miles north of the ridge. A circle of stones, arranged with a deliberate care, as though marking a fire pit. Within it lay charred wood, blackened but old, perhaps from the spring. Rangers examined it but found no traceable artifacts, no belongings, no DNA. Still, the discovery echoed the fisherman's memory of seeing light on the ridge. Someone, perhaps Daniel, perhaps another, had made fire there. The unexplained vehicle in the parking lot remained a shadow in the investigation. Without plates or a clear description, it became a ghostly possibility, an absence investigators could not fill. The gas station clerk's recollection of a man in a cap asking about the road lingered as one of the last tangible threads, though it tied to nothing more than a question at a counter. Theories diverged. Some believed Daniel had encountered a stranger, perhaps the driver of that vehicle, who lured him away under unknown pretenses. Others suggested he stumbled upon someone already hiding in the woods. And in the stillness of the evening, a meeting took place that ended with silence. Still others clung to the possibility that he chose to disappear, though his untouched accounts, unfinished work, and family ties contradicted it. The case was eventually filed as unresolved. His boots were preserved as evidence, the journal sealed in a protective sleeve. His students graduated, his classroom reassigned, but his absence left an enduring mark. The campsite where he vanished became a place people passed with quiet reverence, lowering their voices as though the trees themselves carried memory. What lingers most is the orderliness of the scene. Not chaos, not flight, but the careful setting aside of boots. The calm line of a sentence half written, the fire allowed to dwindle. It was as if the moment was paused, waiting for a return that never came. To this day, those who camp at the lake tell of hearing faint steps on the ridge after dark. Some describe them as heavy, others as light, but always measured, always distant, fading before they can be placed. And sometimes, when the embers of their own fires die down, they glance at the tree line and imagine a lantern's glow moving slowly, steadily, then vanishing into the woods. The official record closes, with Daniel Rowe missing, presumed lost. The unofficial story endures in whispers. A camper who left his boots by the fire and stepped into a trail where silence deepens. Footsteps echo, and a presence unseen may have been waiting. The call log was simple. At 12:03 a.m., a number appeared on the records of the county switchboard. The call lasted 42 seconds. No voice was recorded, no words spoken, only silence interrupted by faint static. The number belonged to a man named Richard Keene, a systems analyst who lived alone in a modest townhouse on the edge of town. He had gone missing 2 days earlier. The phone was found on his nightstand when investigators entered his home. The screen showed no outgoing call at midnight, yet the carrier records confirmed the signal had been routed through a tower less than a mile from his street. It was a contradiction the technicians could not easily explain. The device had remained in place, yet the network insisted it had spoken. Richard was last seen on a Tuesday evening, leaving his office at 7:10 p.m. He drove his usual route, arriving home by 7:40, according to a neighbor who noticed his headlights. At 8:00, he exchanged a brief message with his sister, ordinary words about visiting the following weekend. After that, nothing. His car remained in the driveway, his wallet and keys inside the kitchen. The only anomaly was the phone log, a call made when no one should have been present. Investigators began by examining his routine. Richard lived quietly, his days structured by work, jogging, and evenings spent reading or coding on his personal projects. His colleagues described him as precise, cautious, and reliable. He seldom missed appointments, never failed to respond to messages. That he had vanished without disruption to his home was itself unusual. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no valuables missing. It was as though he had stepped out briefly and never returned. The call at midnight became the central mystery. Technicians examined the phone's data. No application logs showed activity, no microphone engaged, no user input recorded. Yet the call appeared both in the carrier's routing logs and on the receiving end of the switchboard. The operator who answered described it as an open line, static, like wind in a wire. She had repeated greetings, but no one spoke. At exactly 42 seconds, the call ended with a click. The house itself revealed subtle details. A lamp in the living room was left on, its light casting a faint circle across the carpet. The back door was locked from within, as were all windows. A cup of coffee sat cold on the counter, half full. Beside it lay a paperback novel, marked at page 147, open face down as though set aside mid-chapter. On the kitchen wall clock, the hands showed 8:15 when they were checked, though it had since wound down, the battery weak. Investigators reconstructed the evening. If Richard had sat with his coffee at 8:15, he might have placed his book down, intending to return. The timeline from then until midnight was blank. The silence of those hours left room for speculation. Had he left willingly for a walk, been called outside, or encountered someone at his door? Neighbors reported no visitors, no sounds of departure. The night had been uneventful, quiet, the street lights flickering on schedule. One anomaly emerged. At 11:56 p.m., a camera from a business 2 blocks away captured a faint shape crossing the intersection. The figure was blurred, the distance too great to confirm identity. But its outline was similar to Richard's. The figure walked alone, head lowered, moving steadily north. If it was him, he had left the house without car, wallet, or jacket, in weather too cold for comfort. The direction pointed toward the riverfront, a place deserted at night. Yet if he had walked north at midnight, how did his phone call register while the device sat at home? Technicians suggested the possibility of call spoofing, but this required skill and intent. Richard himself possessed technical knowledge, but why would he place a silent call to an operator? And if someone else had done it, why use his number at the precise time he may have been walking into darkness? Inside the phone's memory, one more detail was uncovered. A draft message, never sent, saved at 7:52 p.m., read, "Something's wrong with the line. Keeps buzzing. We'll check later." It was addressed to no one, left in the drafts folder. Investigators interpreted it as a sign Richard had noticed interference on his phone before he vanished. Whether the buzzing was technical or symbolic of something else remained unknown. The riverfront was searched carefully. The banks were muddy from recent rain, the water running high. Teams walked the shore by flashlight, looking for impressions, dropped items, signs of entry. Near the old ferry dock, they found a single glove, black knit, damp from mist. Tests confirmed it belonged to Richard. The discovery suggested he had reached the river's edge that night. But no body was recovered. No footprints survived in the softened soil. For his family, the unanswered call grew more haunting than the missing glove. To them, it felt like Richard had reached out, only to be swallowed by silence before words could form. They asked investigators again and again, if he wasn't home, then who picked up his phone? And if he was at the river, why did the signal trace back here? The contradictions multiplied rather than resolved. An empty house with a glowing lamp, a cup of coffee cooling on the counter, a draft message about buzzing lines, a blurred figure in the distance, a glove at the water's edge, and at the center, a call at midnight that spoke no words but refused to disappear from the records. The investigation moved forward, but the silence of the call lingered, pulling everyone back to the same question. Was it Richard's own attempt to reach out, or was someone, or something, using his phone as a voice that could not speak? The unanswered call lingered in the minds of investigators like an unfinished sentence. To understand it, they began retracing Richard Keene's final days. Not only the night he vanished, His workplace confirmed he had been steady in his duties. No conflicts, no missed deadlines. Yet one colleague recalled a brief conversation where Richard mentioned strange interference on his line at home. He had brushed it off with a smile, but she remembered his tone was more unsettled than casual. Technicians from the phone company tested the lines running through his neighborhood. They found no faults, no frayed wires, no disruptions in service. Yet, when they reviewed logs of his account, they discovered two other anomalies. Brief, incomplete call attempts, one at 2:14 a.m. on Monday, and another at 11:08 p.m. on Tuesday, hours before his disappearance. Both had been dropped instantly, never connecting to a recipient. The system marked them as origin unknown, though tied to his number. This deepened suspicion that someone had tampered with or mimicked his line. Call spoofing was rare in local cases, but not impossible. Still, investigators asked, if it was interference, why did it peak precisely at the hours Richard disappeared? And if it was intentional, who would benefit from leaving behind a trail of silence? The glove found at the river was studied under forensic light. No foreign prints, no blood, only fibers consistent with his coat. Yet he had not taken a coat from the house, raising the possibility that he had left with only gloves in his pocket. His family explained he often kept gloves near the door, slipping them on even for short walks in the cold. But if he had gone out so casually, what drew him there at midnight? Cameras around town were checked again. At 11:56, the blurred figure was seen walking north. At 12:09, another camera 2 blocks further captured faint movement, though the image was distorted by glare. Analysts could not confirm identity, but the timing suggested a continuous walk. If this was Richard, he would have reached the riverfront around 12:20, just after the silent call at 12:03. This overlap of movement and technology became the heart of the puzzle. Was the phone still in his home, or was it somehow echoing from the street? Investigators widened their net to acquaintances. Richard lived alone, but he had a small circle of friends from university, some nearby, some distant. None reported recent conflict. His sister insisted he had been cheerful, planning a visit. A neighbor recalled him asking, days before, if she had heard strange sounds on her phone line. She had not. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a man at Richard's door on Monday evening, though details were vague. Tall, wearing a hood, leaving quickly after knocking. The timing did not align with his disappearance, but it introduced a shadow of another presence, the draft message in his phone. Something's wrong with the line, keeps buzzing, we'll check later. Took on new weight. Was the buzzing simply interference, or did Richard perceive it as something more personal, as though someone was trying to reach him? Colleagues later admitted he had an interest in telecommunications, sometimes tinkering with software-defined radios in his spare time. Investigators considered whether he had discovered signals he wasn't meant to hear, something that unsettled him enough to take late-night walks. The house was searched a second time. In the drawer of his desk, investigators found a spiral notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams of signal towers, frequencies, and handwritten notes. Many were ordinary references, but some lines stood out. Phantom pings, ghost numbers, calls without origin. It seemed Richard had noticed anomalies long before the night of his disappearance. If these diagrams were accurate, the midnight call might not have been an isolated event, but part of a pattern he had been tracking. The thought unnerved investigators. Had Richard stumbled onto something technical, or had he convinced himself of interference that was, in reality, human? Attention returned to the operator, who answered the 12:03 a.m. call. She described the static as layered, like two signals crossing. When asked if she heard any faint words, she hesitated. At first, she said no. Later, after listening again to the preserved log, she admitted she thought she heard breathing, slow, steady, beneath the hiss. This detail shifted the investigation again. If Richard had placed the call, why remain silent? If someone else had, why route it through his number? The possibility emerged that the call was meant as a signal, not communication. A marker of time, a stamp on the record that proved presence without explanation. Investigators revisited the riverfront. A week after the glove was found, a volunteer searcher discovered a scrap of paper caught in driftwood near the dock. Damp and torn, it bore faint writing, a series of numbers, like coordinates, though incomplete. Testing confirmed the paper came from the same notebook found in his desk. The discovery suggested Richard had carried pages with him that night. Yet why leave one at the river's edge? Searches of the river extended further downstream. Nothing else was found. The water was cold, deep, and fast. If he had entered, recovery would have been difficult. Yet without evidence of entry, the theory remained speculative. False leads appeared again. A caller reported hearing a voice like Richard's at a train station in a nearby city. Security footage revealed a different man entirely. Another report claimed a figure had been seen pacing near the river at dawn days later. By the time investigators arrived, the area was empty. The case took on a dual nature, one of physical disappearance, the other of technological anomaly. The glove, the blurred figure, the coffee left cooling. These spoke of a man who left home and never returned. The phone calls, the buzzing line, the diagrams of phantom signals. These spoke of something less tangible, an intrusion that blurred the line between presence and absence. Theories formed quietly among the team. One detective suggested Richard had staged the call as a final act before vanishing, a deliberate puzzle. Another argued he had stumbled into someone else's experiment with lines, becoming entangled. A third believed it was simpler, that the phone had been manipulated to obscure what truly happened that night. But the silence of the call itself remained unyielding. 42 seconds of static, with no words, only faint breath and the hum of crossed wires. A line open just long enough to haunt. And so investigators were left with an unresolved truth. Richard Keene had noticed something wrong with his line, spoken of footsteps unheard by others, left his glove by the river, and vanished into the dark. At the center of it all was a phone that dialed at midnight, carrying silence across the wires. By autumn, the search for Richard Keene had grown quieter, though not closed. The case file swelled with notes about phone anomalies, sighting reports, and forensic fragments. Yet no resolution emerged. What investigators had, at best, were pieces that refused to fit together. The midnight call remained the central riddle. To technicians, it was evidence of interference, a network glitch made uncanny by its timing. To detectives, it was a signal, a deliberate marker tied to the moment Richard was last seen. To his family, it felt like a final attempt to reach out, interrupted before words could travel. Each interpretation carried its own weight, none strong enough to close the case. Attention turned once more to his desk notebook. The diagrams of phantom pings and ghost numbers had seemed eccentric at first, the musings of a man fascinated by signals. But a closer reading revealed a sequence of dates. Each marked a moment when Richard believed he had experienced interference. The last entry bore the date of his disappearance with a single note: "If it happens again, follow it." The phrase suggested intent, that he expected the buzzing line to return, and that he was prepared to act. The blurred figure walking north at 11:56 p.m. became, in hindsight, less ambiguous. Investigators leaned toward accepting it was Richard. His gloves, one recovered at the river, supported the theory he left with them on. If the figure was indeed him, then he had walked into the night purposefully, perhaps in response to the very interference he had studied. But the contradiction remained. How could his phone, sitting on his nightstand, generate a call at 12:03 a.m. if he was not there to place it? Some argued he had set up a system in advance, an automated dial triggered by signal interference. Others countered there was no evidence of such programming on his device. The possibility lingered that someone else had entered the house, used the phone briefly, and left it behind, though the locked doors and untouched alarm suggested otherwise. Weeks later, the carrier company released a technical note. On rare occasions, misrouted calls could appear as if made from numbers that were, in truth, inactive at the time. The explanation seemed plausible. Yet the operator's insistence that she heard breathing beneath the static prevented full acceptance. If it was only interference, why would the silence carry the cadence of a living presence? The river yielded no further traces. Divers returned in late summer when the water was low, but the search ended empty. The scrap of paper with numbers remained the last physical clue. Analysts attempted to match the partial coordinates to local maps. They pointed roughly toward the riverfront itself, though incomplete, leaving open whether Richard had been marking his destination or simply noting interference sources. For his family, the absence hardened into a quiet grief. His sister kept his phone, refusing to replace the battery, leaving it dark on her mantle. She said it felt like keeping the last place his voice had almost traveled. His colleagues framed his desk notebook as evidence of curiosity rather than obsession. The town remembered him as a quiet figure who left for a walk one night and never returned. The official file eventually listed him as missing, presumed deceased. The midnight call was logged as inconclusive anomaly. The glove, personal effect, unrecovered pair. The blurred figure, possible subject, unconfirmed. Each line reduced to administrative language what had once been alive with urgency. But unofficially, the story grew into something else. Residents began speaking of their own late-night calls, brief rings from unknown numbers, answered only to find silence. Some dismissed them as ordinary spam, others as coincidence. Yet, in the wake of Richard's disappearance, they carried an edge of unease. More than one neighbor admitted that when they answered such calls, they thought they heard faint breathing on the line. For investigators who had spent months immersed in the case, the silence itself became the defining feature. Not just the silence of a phone call, but the silence of unanswered questions, of a man who walked into the night and left only fragments behind. His house still stood, modest and unchanged, a lamp glowing faintly in the living room where bulbs were never removed. The clock in the kitchen was reset, its battery replaced. Yet the memory of its frozen hands at 8:15 remained a marker in time. The story closes not with a resolution, but with the persistence of absence. Richard Keene is still missing. The glove, the scrap of numbers, the draft message, and the call that carried static remain in the file. Whether he followed a signal too far, encountered someone waiting in the dark, or simply vanished into the river, no one can say. And so the case endures in quiet retellings. A silent phone that dialed at midnight, breathing faintly across the wires, marking the moment a man stepped beyond the reach of both technology and human search. The ship had been scheduled to leave at noon. By 10 in the morning, passengers were already boarding, dragging suitcases across the gangway, their voices echoing in the bright salt air. Among them was a man named Thomas Avery, age 46, a salesman from the Midwest traveling alone. He checked in at the terminal, his ticket scanned, his luggage tagged and placed aboard. Records confirmed that he stepped onto the gangway, smiled faintly at the attendant, and walked up onto the ship. But when the vessel departed 2 hours later, Thomas Avery was gone. The discovery began quietly. His cabin attendant, making rounds at dusk, noted that the room assigned to Avery remained untouched. The bed was still made, the bathroom unused, the suitcase unopened. A single boarding pass lay on the desk, folded carefully, as though set down for later. Assuming he had chosen to remain on deck, the attendant left. But the next morning, the room was the same. His belongings sat as they had been delivered, no sign of occupation. He had boarded, yet he had never settled into his space. Security staff reviewed the gangway footage. Thomas was seen entering at 10:14 a.m. He wore a navy jacket and carried a small briefcase. He did not appear distressed nor hurried. After stepping onto the ship, cameras caught him walking across the lobby, glancing briefly at a wall clock. At 10:16, he disappeared from view as he turned toward the elevators. It was the last confirmed image. What unsettled investigators was the absence of any later sighting. Cruise ships carried dozens of cameras, sweeping the restaurants, decks, and halls. Passengers were captured endlessly, sipping coffee, playing cards, watching the horizon. Yet not once in 2 days of footage did Thomas reappear. He had walked into the ship's interior, then ceased to exist within its recordings. Interviews with staff yielded little. No one recalled serving him meals. No bartender recalled pouring him a drink. No steward remembered passing him in the hall. The passenger manifest confirmed he had no companions. Fellow travelers in adjacent cabins reported never seeing him. It was as if the ship had swallowed him whole between lobby and elevator. Authorities at the departure port were contacted. They confirmed he had checked his luggage and cleared security. The suitcase in his cabin matched the tags. There was no record of him returning ashore. The ship had sailed with him on board, and yet he was nowhere. Investigators began to dissect the footage more carefully. At 10:15, as Thomas turned toward the elevators, another figure briefly crossed behind him. An older man in a dark coat, face obscured by a brimmed hat. The man walked steadily toward a service corridor, passing through an unmarked door with a staff access key. His presence was odd. The corridor was meant for employees, yet no staff later identified him. The briefcase Thomas carried never appeared again. It was not found in his cabin, not checked into storage, not turned in as lost property. It had vanished along with him. This detail complicated theories of accidental fall or self-harm. If he had gone overboard, why had the case disappeared separately? Investigators searched the ship meticulously. Engine rooms, storage bays, staff quarters, all were checked. Nothing. Dogs brought aboard at the next port traced his scent faintly along the lobby carpets, but lost it near the elevators. There was no trace in stairwells, no scent on deck, no evidence of him entering or leaving. Passengers began to whisper. Stories spread in dining rooms of a man who boarded and never returned, of a cabin sealed with tape, of crew who said less than they knew. Some insisted they had seen him later that day, reading quietly on the promenade, but when shown photographs, none were certain. Memory bent under repetition. Investigators returned to his life ashore. Thomas was a quiet man, diligent at work, no debts, no known conflicts. He told colleagues he looked forward to the cruise as a break from routine. His sister described him as methodical, careful, the sort who kept receipts in order. No signs pointed to voluntary disappearance. And so the first section of the case closed on a simple, chilling truth. Thomas Avery boarded a ship, his luggage placed neatly in his cabin. Cameras recorded him turning toward the elevators. From that moment onward, he was never seen again. What lies between the lobby clock that marked 10:16 and the silence that followed remains the unanswered question. How can a passenger step onto a vessel surrounded by cameras, crew, and fellow travelers, and then dissolve without a trace before the ship even leaves the dock? The disappearance of Thomas Avery quickly attracted the attention of port authorities and maritime investigators. A missing passenger at sea was not uncommon, but this case carried a peculiarity that unsettled even seasoned officials. Thomas had vanished before the ship had left the dock. The review of security tapes intensified. Investigators slowed the footage frame by frame, watching Thomas approach the elevators at 10:16 a.m. A handful of passengers passed through the lobby during those minutes. Each could be accounted for later in the voyage. Only Thomas and the unidentified man in the dark coat remained unresolved. The man had entered a service corridor reserved for crew. His image was grainy, the brim of his hat shielding his face. Still, his body language, measured, deliberate, caught investigators' attention. Crew were questioned one by one. All denied recognizing the man. Service corridors required staff key cards, yet records showed no entry logged at that moment. This meant either the man carried an unregistered card or the door had been held open. Neither option was easy to explain. Thomas's briefcase became the next focus. Luggage tags had placed his suitcase in the cabin, but the smaller case he carried aboard had disappeared. Passenger reports gave conflicting stories. One woman claimed she saw a man with a similar case sitting near the aft deck shortly before departure. Another believed she noticed the same man in the terminal cafe an hour after boarding. Neither could be confirmed. The briefcase, like its owner, remained elusive. Investigators then turned to Thomas's background. His life seemed unremarkable. He had worked for years at the same company, lived in a modest apartment, and kept in touch with his sister. No debts, no legal trouble. Yet one detail stood out. He had booked the cruise only 3 days before departure. A sudden decision unusual for a man known for careful planning. His colleagues said he mentioned wanting a change of scenery, but offered no reason. The possibility of voluntary disappearance was weighed. Could Thomas have slipped off the ship before departure unseen? Port security insisted it was unlikely. The gangway was monitored, and no footage showed him returning. The terminal itself had controlled exits. To vanish before sailing would have required slipping through staff areas or unmonitored doors. If so, why book the voyage at all? False leads began to emerge. A passenger insisted she had spoken to Thomas at dinner the first night, but her description failed to match his appearance. Another claimed to see him walking the deck in early morning fog, but no cameras supported it. The human tendency to overlay memory onto mystery created ghosts where none could be confirmed. Investigators pursued the unknown man in the coat. Still frames were circulated among crew, port staff, and even passengers who had disembarked. No one identified him. The ship's logs listed no such passenger, and crew rosters were complete. Whoever he was, he existed in that footage and nowhere else. The service corridor where he disappeared led to a warren of staff-only spaces, storage rooms, and maintenance shafts. Searches found nothing. No briefcase, no trace of Thomas. Attention returned to the timeline. At 10:14, Thomas boarded. At 10:16, he walked toward the elevators. At 10:18, the man in the coat entered the service corridor. By 10:30, when the ship began its final boarding checks, neither appeared again. Less than 15 minutes held the gap in which both man and passenger dissolved. Investigators examined the port itself. Could Thomas have left through another vessel? Small service boats often clustered near the dock. One operator recalled seeing a figure step onto a maintenance skiff that morning, but at a distance too great to confirm identity. If true, it meant Thomas may have left intentionally or been escorted away before departure. Yet records of the skiff showed it was unregistered. A hired boat performing repairs for a contractor whose paperwork proved incomplete. By the time the lead was followed, the boat was gone. Theories spread among crew. Some whispered Thomas had slipped into crew areas and fallen into machinery, though no evidence supported it. Others believed he had staged his vanishing, boarding only to walk out again through hidden routes. To the passengers, the story took on the quality of rumor. The salesman who boarded but never sailed, the cabin sealed like a shrine, the cameras that blinked yet failed to hold his image. For investigators, the absence of resolution pressed harder. Every vessel had strict reporting protocols. Yet, in this case, all they had were fragments. A man boarding, a briefcase vanishing, a stranger in a coat, and a ship leaving port with a cabin prepared for a guest who never returned. The unanswered question grew heavier with each review of the footage. If Thomas Avery did not remain on the ship, then he left it unseen. And if he did remain, then he found a corner of the vessel where cameras, crew, and fellow travelers could not follow. That contradiction left investigators with only one path forward: to trace his movements beyond the ship, to test whether he had stepped ashore unseen, or whether his story ended somewhere within the steel walls of a vessel that carried no memory of him after 10:16 a.m. As the investigation pressed into its third month, Thomas Avery's disappearance had become a riddle recounted in two halves. One, the clear record of a man who boarded a ship with luggage and intent to travel. And two, the void that followed. No presence, no movements, no resolution. Theories continued to branch in all directions. Some investigators leaned toward voluntary disappearance. Thomas had booked the trip suddenly, his briefcase missing, his life otherwise unremarkable. Had he boarded simply to establish the illusion of travel before slipping away unseen? If so, how had he evaded cameras, crew, and port security? And why abandon the suitcase delivered to his cabin, leaving behind identifiers that ensured his absence would be noticed? Others believed he had been the victim of an encounter on board. The unknown man in the coat remained the most troubling piece. Investigators studied his brief appearance again and again. The steady gait, the service door closing behind him. No record, no identity, no follow-up sighting. If he was crew, his name was missing from rosters. If he was passenger, his boarding was never logged. He seemed to exist only for those brief seconds captured on camera, then disappeared as completely as Thomas himself. The possibility of both men leaving together was considered. The unregistered skiff seen near the dock that morning loomed large. Its contractor paperwork contained gaps that could not be reconciled. By the time authorities tracked the company, the boat had vanished from the port entirely. If Thomas had been taken, or had chosen, to step aboard it, then the ship may have been only a stage, his presence a shadow designed to mislead. The briefcase never surfaced. No pawn shop, no lost and found, no traveler carried it ashore. Its absence carried as much weight as Thomas's. What had it held that he did not want left behind? Or had it been taken by another, leaving him behind? The lack of answers allowed speculation to widen until every possibility seemed plausible. The cabin itself became a haunting symbol. Crew cleaned it, but many avoided the space. Passengers whispered as they walked past, lowering their voices. The untouched bed, the suitcase neatly placed, the folded boarding pass, all suggested a guest who intended to return shortly. The room felt less abandoned than paused, as though waiting for footsteps that never came. Months later, maritime authorities issued their final statement. Thomas Avery was declared missing, presumed lost under circumstances undetermined. The official report noted no evidence of foul play, no confirmation of voluntary disappearance, no sign of accidental fall. Each possibility was acknowledged, none concluded. But outside official records, the story grew. Passengers who had sailed on the voyage told of hearing his name whispered in dining rooms, of glimpsing a man in a navy jacket standing at the rail only for him to vanish when approached. Crew remembered odd details, a call light flashing in his cabin, though the room was empty, a steward insisting he heard a door close inside, though no one had checked in. Whether these were true recollections or the shaping of memory under mystery, no one could say. For his family, the absence was a wound without closure. They received his suitcase, carefully returned by the cruise line. Inside were shirts folded, books unread, and receipts from the week before. Nothing suggested plans for vanishing. The briefcase, like its owner, remained absent, and so the case settled into silence. The unanswered questions lingered. Did Thomas step aboard only to leave again by hidden passage? Was he taken through a service corridor by a man whose name was never known? Or did he remain, concealed somewhere the cameras could not reach, dissolving into the ship's hidden spaces? The vessel itself continues to sail, cabins filled with new guests, decks washed by tides. Yet some passengers, walking the lobby where the wall clock still hangs, pause at the elevators. They imagine the moment frozen in time, 10:16 a.m. A man in a navy jacket carrying a briefcase stepping towards the lift. They know that from that instant forward, he was never seen again. And in the quiet retelling, the ship carries not only travelers, but also the memory of a passenger who boarded with ticket in hand, luggage in cabin, and promise of a journey ahead, yet somehow never left the dock at all. The fire began just after midnight, consuming the old farmhouse at the edge of a quiet county road. By the time neighbors saw the glow against the sky and called for help, the structure was already beyond saving. Fire crews arrived to find the roof collapsing, windows shattered outward, smoke pouring into the night. What struck investigators most was not the violence of the fire itself, but the swiftness. Within 40 minutes, the building was reduced to charred beams and ash. The farmhouse belonged to Leonard Briggs, a retired mechanic in his late 60s. He had lived there alone since his wife passed away years earlier. Friends described him as cautious, almost obsessive about maintenance, checking locks twice, shutting off appliances, keeping fire extinguishers in plain sight. That such a man's home could burn so quickly felt wrong, but what made the case turn from accident to puzzle was a detail uncovered days later. Leonard had signed a new life insurance policy less than a week before the fire. At first, responders assumed he had perished in the flames. Yet, when the ruins cooled enough to search, no remains were found. Every corner of the structure was sifted carefully, but nothing emerged. No bone, no trace. Not even the metal fixtures of a prosthetic Leonard was known to wear. It was as if he had not been inside at all. Investigators reconstructed the evening. Neighbors last saw him at dusk, sitting on his porch with a book, a lantern glowing at his side. Around 9:00 a.m., one neighbor heard the faint sound of a radio from inside the house. By 10:00, the property was silent. By midnight, the fire was visible, spreading too fast for anyone to intervene. No vehicle was seen leaving, though the gravel driveway could have masked the sound. Inside the ruins, one object drew attention: a safe pulled from the basement, its metal blackened but intact. When opened, investigators found documents, receipts, and Leonard's newly signed insurance policy. The policy named his estranged nephew as beneficiary, a man Leonard had rarely spoken to in years. The timing was unsettling. The nephew had visited only once that month, arriving unannounced the day the policy was signed. Leonard's friends recalled him looking uneasy afterward, though he said little. Forensic teams tested the ash for accelerants. Traces of accelerant were found near the kitchen, suggesting the fire had been set intentionally. Yet without remains, the question shifted from cause to circumstance. Was Leonard killed before the fire? Did he escape and vanish? Or had the fire been staged as a curtain for something else? His car was missing from the property. Weeks later, it was discovered abandoned 5 miles away, parked neatly at the edge of a dirt road leading into forest. The keys were not inside. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than Leonard typically set it. No prints were recovered beyond smudges impossible to match. The placement of the car suggested it had been left intentionally, not stolen and discarded. Investigators began interviewing the nephew, who admitted he had encouraged Leonard to update his affairs for security. He denied involvement in the fire, claiming he was at home 2 counties away. His alibi was partially supported by phone records, though the timing left gaps. His financial situation was strained, with debts recorded in court filings. The new policy promised a significant payout. Yet another detail complicated the case. In the safe, alongside the insurance papers, was a small ledger filled with Leonard's handwriting. In the days before the fire, he had noted strange visits, someone watching at the lane. Neighbors confirmed seeing an unfamiliar truck parked near the property more than once. Leonard's notes ended 2 days before the fire with a final line. Policy signed. Do not trust, visit. The contradiction grew sharper. If Leonard feared for his safety, why sign the policy at all? And if he suspected danger, why remain alone in a house that became his last known place? The case opened with a farmhouse swallowed by flames, a missing man, and an insurance policy inked days before. At the center of the smoke and ash lay a silence more troubling than fire itself. The absence of Leonard Briggs, whose careful routines should have shielded him from such disaster, and whose final notes suggested he may have seen it coming. The mystery of Leonard Briggs' disappearance deepened as investigators tried to disentangle the fire from the man himself. To them, the house was not only a scene of destruction, but a deliberate message. Every scrap of evidence seemed to suggest presence. Documents in the safe, coffee mugs in the sink, a lantern on the porch, yet his body was nowhere. It was as though Leonard had prepared his home for evening, only to step out moments before it became a furnace. The accelerant samples confirmed intentional ignition. Laboratory results identified traces of kerosene near the kitchen and basement stairs, substances Leonard never stored on the property. The pattern suggested multiple points of origin, fires set to blossom simultaneously. This made accident impossible. It was arson. But arson in service of what? Attention turned first to the nephew, Daniel Briggs. His sudden re-emergence in Leonard's life, his financial troubles, and the convenient timing of the new policy marked him as the prime suspect. Detectives interviewed him multiple times. He repeated the same story. He had encouraged his uncle to update paperwork out of concern, not profit. On the night of the fire, he claimed to be at home, speaking with friends on the phone. Call logs showed activity around 11 p.m., but between 11:30 and 12:30, the critical window, no calls were made or received. Investigators pressed further. Daniel denied ever visiting the farmhouse beyond the day of the policy signing. Yet neighbors recalled seeing a truck resembling his parked at the lane 3 nights before the fire. When confronted, Daniel explained he sometimes borrowed vehicles for odd jobs, but no record confirmed this. Still, doubts lingered. Detectives knew the absence of a body complicated motive. If Leonard was alive, Daniel could not yet claim the policy. And if Leonard had perished unseen, the lack of remains prevented legal closure. The fire created confusion, but not resolution, raising the possibility that its purpose was concealment rather than inheritance. Meanwhile, investigators retraced Leonard's final movements. A local store clerk remembered him buying canned goods the evening before the fire. He had been calm, speaking little, paying in cash. His purchase included matches, though Leonard already kept plenty at home. Surveillance footage showed him leaving with the bag and driving his car away alone. This was the last confirmed sighting. The discovery of the abandoned car added another layer. Parked neatly on the dirt road, it looked less like a thief's discard than a deliberate placement. Tire impressions showed it had been driven in and backed out carefully. positioned close to the forest line. Dogs brought to the scene caught a faint trail into the woods, but lost it within a mile. Whether Leonard himself walked there or someone else staged the trail was impossible to determine. Investigators also reviewed Leonard's small ledger of notes. His words were sparse but suggestive. Strange visits, Truckett Lane, policy signed, and finally, do not trust visit. The implication was that Leonard felt watched in the days leading to the fire. Neighbors corroborated seeing headlights pause on the road at unusual hours. Yet no license plate was captured, and no vehicle identified. The insurance company confirmed the policy had been signed in person at Leonard's kitchen table. The agent described Leonard as reluctant, repeatedly asking questions about cancellation clauses and payout conditions. The nephew sat beside him, occasionally answering on his behalf. The meeting ended with Leonard's quiet signature. Days later, the house was ash. Forensic review of the safe revealed fingerprints. Leonard's, Daniel's, and faint traces belonging to an unknown third person. The prints were partial, smudged, impossible to match in databases. Whether they belonged to the insurance agent, a visitor, or someone else entirely could not be proved. Speculation broadened. Some investigators suggested Leonard may have staged his own disappearance, signing the policy, leaving the ledger, and vanishing before the fire could have been his way of stepping out of a life he no longer wished to carry. Yet this conflicted with his character. Cautious, tied to routine, not prone to sudden departures. Friends insisted he loved his land, his porch, his quiet evenings. To abandon it seemed unthinkable. Others argued Leonard had been forced out, taken or lured away, his house burned to erase traces. If so, the arsonist failed to hide everything. The accelerant, the missing body, the abandoned car, all pointed toward a plan but not perfection. False leads complicated the search. A man matching Leonard's description was reportedly seen at a bus depot 2 counties away, but security footage showed another traveler. A credit card in his name was swiped at a roadside diner, only to be revealed as a case of mistaken entry. Each possibility dissolved upon inspection, leaving only the void. The investigation narrowed again to 3 hard facts. Leonard's car parked deliberately in the woods, the accelerant-driven fire, and the newly signed insurance policy. At their intersection lay motive and opportunity, but no conclusion. And so, Section 2 closes in tension. Did Leonard flee before the fire, leaving a ledger of warnings? Did his nephew press him into signing a policy and then act upon it? Or did an unseen visitor, the truck at the lane, the third set of fingerprints, write the final chapter of a life now measured only by ash and absence? By winter, the ashes of the Briggs farmhouse had long cooled, yet the questions they concealed still smoldered. Investigators had exhausted their leads, but the contradictions of the case resisted closure. Leonard's ledger spoke of suspicion. The fire proved deliberate, and his absence remained the most troubling evidence of all. The insurance company withheld any payout, citing the lack of a death certificate. Without a body, the policy stood in limbo. The nephew pressed his claim but could not overcome the void at the center of the case. Each filing returned with the same response: insufficient proof of loss. The fire had erased a house, not a life. Attention shifted again to Leonard's abandoned car. Forensic teams re-examined the interior. Under the driver's seat, wedged deep in the carpet, they found a matchbook partially burned along one edge. Its cover bore the name of a bar in a neighboring town, a place Leonard had not been known to visit. Patrons were questioned. None recalled him. Yet the presence of the matchbook suggested either he had gone there in his final days or someone else had left it in his car. The object added more intrigue than clarity. The forest path where the dogs had lost his scent was walked again in silence. Winter leaves had fallen. Snow crusted the ground, and any trace of his passage was long erased. Some searchers believed he had walked deeper, perhaps meeting someone where tracks could not be followed. Others imagined the car as a false trail, parked deliberately to suggest his departure into woods he never entered. The nephew remained a figure of suspicion, but not of proof. His debts mounted, his answers never shifted, his alibi never firmed. Yet, without Leonard's body or clearer evidence, no charges could stand. His presence in the story lingered like smoke, thick, unavoidable, but intangible. The theory of Leonard staging his disappearance was revisited. To some, the careful notes in his ledger, the deliberate parking of his car, and the absence of remains suggested planning. But where would a 70-year-old man vanish to without drawing attention, leaving behind bank accounts untouched, letters unwritten, and family uncertain? Staging such an exit required resources he did not have, and so investigators returned to the fire itself. It had been fierce, fast, precise. The accelerant was placed in multiple locations, the ignition point chosen carefully. This was not the work of a panicked hand, but of deliberate control. Whoever lit the flames knew what they wanted destroyed. Yet what they sought to erase, Leonard, or evidence within, remained unclear. Months stretched into years. The farmhouse was never rebuilt, the land overgrown with weeds and vines. Locals driving past the ruins still spoke of headlights pausing at the lane, of shadows moving where no house stood. Hunters claimed to find footprints near the abandoned car site, though snow and soil distorted them beyond certainty. For Leonard's friends, the absence remained louder than the fire. They recalled his habits, his steady voice, his porch lamp glowing into evening. None believed he would simply walk away. They spoke instead of the ledger's last line, "Do not trust, visit." Those words became the final testimony of a man who foresaw danger but could not name it. The official record closed with no resolution. Leonard Briggs was declared missing, presumed dead. His fate tied forever to a farmhouse that burned too quickly, and a policy signed too soon. The nephew inherited nothing. The land lay empty, and the questions remained. The story now endures in retelling of a man who warned of strangers at his lane, signed a policy days before his home ignited, and left behind only ash, an abandoned car, and silence. Whether he fled into the night, was taken by those he feared, or perished unseen in the fire, no one can say. What remains is the uneasy truth that sometimes a life can vanish, not only in flames, but in the space between what was witnessed and what was left behind.